Hey, welcome to another edition of the Collaboration Podcast. My name is Jonathan Kay. This time I'm not with my I normally have a co-host, Marco Massi, but he's not with me today. But I'm very, very honored to be here with Sean Kelly, who has contributed to the collaboration, volume 48, number 2. The title of the edition is Relationships as Spiritual Practice. We can see the cover here. And Sean, your article here is a Planetary Initiation. And I'm just going to say a little bit about you for those who aren't familiar with who you are. So in the front of our edition here, there's a short bio. Sean Kelly is a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in the Department of Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. He has taught religious studies at the University of Windsor, the University of Ottawa, and Carleton University in Canada. Sean's area of research includes the evolution of consciousness, integral ecologies, and transpersonal and integral theory. He is the author of many books and articles. His latest book, Becoming Gaia, On the Threshold of Planetary Initiation, further develops some of the themes he discusses in this issue of collaboration. And so I guess that would be our first clue for those of you more interested in opening up these ideas that you've introduced in your article, is to get that book. But yes, I met you at California Institute of Integral Studies. I'm in the East-West Psychology Department. You're in the Philosophy, Cosmology, Consciousness. But there's a lot that these two departments share and are kind of sisters in siblings in many ways. And so it's been wonderful though I haven't taken one of your classes, but I've known a lot of people that have studied closely with you and had a chance to hear some of your talks at the school. And it's been really always inspiring and, you bring, I think, problems of our times to the forefront in very compelling, interesting, inspiring, but also challenging ways. And I just want to thank you for that. And I think that this article is just a kind of like a seed of a lot of what I've heard from you over the years. And maybe you could start just by maybe giving us a little bit of background about, what you were thinking when you wrote this, maybe how it relates to your book too.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Jonathan, for having me today. It's great to meet you face to face after, being all of us being more or less isolated for so long. First of all, I haven't written many books, just a little clarification. I mean, co-edited 3 books, and I guess authored 3 books and quite a few articles. But yeah, so this contribution to your lovely journal is actually an edited transcript of an interview that I was interviewed for the film Conscious, which you may recall. So yeah, that's where that came from. And the interview actually took place when I was gestating the book that became Becoming Gaia, On the Threshold of Planetary Initiation. But the theme for that book, as well as what came out in the interview, is a theme and the related themes that have been living through me for quite some time. And of course, the main theme, well, at least with planetary initiation, is a theme that I think all of us in one way or another are living through, and that is living through us in various ways. But even in the how many years now? 5, 7 years since that interview, the planetary situation continues to accelerate toward greater uncertainty, greater unrest, um, on so many levels. So that's the context, and the actual planetary uh, situation that we are embedded in, that we are fated and in many ways blessed, strangely to say, to be alive
Mhm.
in, at least those of us who are privileged enough to be able to reflect on the nature of our moment, are blessed to be able to participate in it. Of course, there are so many uh, of our fellow humans and many, most of the other than humans who don't have the privilege that maybe people like you and I have, who are caught in deep nets of suffering. So anyway, that's the context.
Yes, thank you very much.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, and I think that that's, in terms of how I've learned from Debashish Banerjee, the head of East West Psychology Department, but he really has encouraged me in my thinking through philosophy or psychology, but like really like kind of trying to figure out, well, what's the problematic that is kind of driving our questions, our desires, and how can that kind of ground an inquiry in a sense. And I just wanted to read, this is a short paragraph or a sentence really, um, from the middle of your on page 13 here, which seems to sum up the kind of problematic that you're really kind of stating here to and bringing forth your ideas in relation to. So what we're really being called to do at this point is to respond with urgency and all of the wisdom and courage that we can muster to halt the unraveling of life on the planet, to stop the situation of planetary apartheid that is condemning billions of people to poverty and suffering. This is what we're being called to do, which is really very resonant with exactly what you just said. Um, and so if this is the starting point and the kind of the problematic that we find ourselves in, and it is a planetary condition,
Mhm.
it's clearly there's not, you can't really say that there's a part of the planet that's not touched by these forces of modernity or postmodernity or capitalism or what any other type of kind of idea along those lines. And this is where it's like the call to think together, to think with the earth. And I think that this is just one of the most important ways of framing our problematic, undeniably so. And I think that the clarity in which you do that is very important.
Mm.
I was gonna then ask how, in your life you've put together a kind of or the kind of genealogy of thinking, or a kind of a milieu to help you think this problem.
Mhm.
Because obviously you're coming from certain philosophical lineages and other thinkers in the world, scientific thinking and psychological thinking. And Sri Aurobindo is one of those thinkers. And
Mhm.
because Collaboration is a journal of integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. I'd just like you to also, maybe talk about how Sri Aurobindo and the mother have helped in thinking this problematic, as well as the other thinkers in that you have kind of found resonances with, or that are helpful in this way.
Right. Yeah, well, my entryway, I guess, the first thinker that really started to wake me up to this theme, this problematic, and who I recognized as a spiritual mentor was Carl Jung.
Hmm.
And I had a kind of very early conversion experience to Jung and his thinking in my very early 20s, 21, 22. So he got woven into my intellectual, spiritual DNA quite young. And it was two things for Jung. It was his conviction that the human being um, and yeah, the human being is guided by an impulse toward the actualization of wholeness.
Hmm.
And that this wholeness is not only an individual matter, but involves the collective and indeed, in some sense, the cosmos and the divine as an integral whole. Um, and not long after that, I discovered Hegel. So I ended up writing my dissertation on Hegel and Jung. And Hegel, of course, also proposed a view not only of the individual, but of history and of indeed the cosmos and the divine as a single, we could say, integral whole or totality that is involved in the process of its own actualization, which he described in terms of the actualization of freedom, but we could also think of it as an evolution of consciousness. So Hegel and Jung were at the foundation. Now, as you know, Sri Aurobindo studied in England and was educated by neo-Hegelians. And if you read The Life Divine, for instance, you'll see a term like the real idea capitalized that Sri Aurobindo uses many, many times,
Mhm.
which is basically taken from Hegel, Hegel's logic. So Hegel and Hegelian thinking had a profound influence on Sri Aurobindo's language and thinking. Although he doesn't, yeah. For those who have eyes to see, you can see Hegel's influence very, very deeply in The Life Divine. So
Mhm.
Jung, Hegel, Sri Aurobindo are three very compatible figures that each of which have informed me in their own way. Obviously, with Sri Aurobindo, we get something that we don't get in Hegel, and that is in Sri Aurobindo's terms, a supramental or an opening to that which is more than somehow beyond the rational mind.
Mhm.
Um, but actually, these three figures are really complementary for that very reason. That Jung is really grounded in the phenomenology of individual experience.
Mhm.
Hegel offers us the most comprehensive, coherent, systematic, rational framework, and then Sri Aurobindo, whose thinking is compatible with both Jung and Hegel, makes this framework transparent to the transcendent, to the divine, for those who are open to that. So yeah, these are our main figures. Um, Now, the other figure that's been very important for me, well, I'll mention just a couple of others for our listeners who might want to,
Mhm.
wonder who might be helpful in our times. One, of course, is Thomas Berry and his spiritual mentor Teilhard de Chardin. Um, No, I'm not sure whether Sri Aurobindo. No, I guess Teilhard was reading Sri Aurobindo. That's right. I
Mhm.
think Teilhard was aware of Sri Aurobindo, but Teilhard de Chardin. There's actually a new documentary that just came out, a 2-hour documentary on Teilhard that people can watch if they're interested. He also proposed this view of the cosmos and of the human and of the divine, all three as involved in an integral evolution toward awakening, which in Teilhard's terms was an awakening to the reality of the divine as love, we could say as unconditional love. Very compatible with the idea of infinite, ananda or bliss as the ground of the evolution of cosmos and of consciousness, according to Sri Aurobindo. So Teilhard de Chardin, but then his main student, at least in the lineage of Teilhard, is Thomas Berry, so-called geologian, not a theologian, Thomas Berry, uh, who was the main teacher and collaborator of my dear friend and colleague, from whom I've learned so much, Brian Swim, who just retired from the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. So through Brian Swim and Thomas Berry in that Teilhard lineage, I've been really nourished and educated as to the intrinsically numinous, sacred character of this living earth and
Mhm.
of the cosmos as a whole, as a manifestation of, we could say, divine, numinous, or sacred energy that has an interior dimension that is, in some sense, sentient, or at least is not other than what we might call consciousness or the divine. So these are the main figures. I could mention, well, two others, Joanna Macy,
Mhm. Beautiful. Yeah.
who's dear friend and colleague. co-taught at CIS for many years. She helped me, make links between my otherwise predominantly metaphysical orientation. This is, all things being equal, if I were left to myself, I would probably just be doing theology, metaphysics, maybe art, poetry, right? But because of what's happening to the Earth community uh, as a whole, I've felt compelled to turn my attention to lower my gaze somewhat to the imminent, to the earthly plane. And Joanna Macy especially has helped me see the power and beauty and moral uh, imperative to fully embrace this living earth and to do what we can in our own individual ways to help, as Martin Luther King would say, bend the arc of history towards justice somewhat. So yeah, Joanna Macy brings in this very strong activist moral dimension, and she draws more from the Buddha Dharma and from systems theory and deep ecology. So they're yeah. So I'm able to stop there for a second. These are my main companions along the way.
Beautiful. No, thank you so much. And I think it's just really enriching to hear how, you're describing different thinkers that share certain problems, I guess, of becoming, yet are approaching different perspectives on that problem. And kind of like, in a sense, it's kind of to build ourselves integrally, it's important to have like a multiplicity or an ecology of knowledges that can help us to kind of find the blind spots that are kind of always present in any one perspective. There's always something that that is
Exactly.
kind of, yeah. And so this question of wholeness, because the integral Purnam yoga is called the wholeness. I was just, in terms of, I was wondering if we could relate that to the notion of the evolution of consciousness. And the thinkers that you brought up are, most of them anyway, could be considered for like philosophers or thinkers of the philosophy of history.
Mhm.
Especially Hegel, but Sri Aurobindo, again, taking up different problematics from different spaces. Um, but the activist part is really important, because of our times and because of this question, the social, the political, the ethical is really, starting to fray. And it's like these questions are at the core of, like, we can't necessarily afford to think about, the individual and individual desires or whatnot without actually getting right to the core of, well, an individual can't exist without a collective. We are always more than individual.
Mm.
um, but yeah, in that sense, I mean, I found that when I met Debashish, he really brought out for me the kind of idea in Sri Aurobindo's yoga, that he turned to yoga for activist reasons, to address the problem of colonialism,
Mm.
and to bring into, I guess, to bring forward a different notion of the individual that can then extend itself into a new type of sociality or politics and whatnot. But maybe that's just like, I could say something like the politics of wholeness is at stake here, because
Mm.
our notion of what is whole, or how we approach that question, can kind of bring up certain types of politics, certain types of situations. I mean, you could say even that notion drove colonialism, to say,
Yeah.
well, we see the world as whole in our image, and we're going to impose that. But maybe I'm just kind of throwing a lot out there, but I'd
Yeah,
love
no,
to
that's
hear
good.
any
That's
thoughts
good.
that you have.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that Sri Aurobindo shares with somebody like Hegel, let's say, or Jung, with regard
Mhm.
to the notion of wholeness or the intuition of
Mhm.
wholeness. Like we see, for instance, where Sri Aurobindo talks about the two negations, the typical negation of the West, which is to negate the transcendent, at least the late modern West, and the typical negation of the East, by which he means mostly India, I think, is to favor the transcendent and to consider the immanent plane as somehow Maya or merely Maya or illusory and so on. So the whole, the Purnadvaita, the truly whole non-dualism, has to negate each of these negations, or otherwise said, has to honor both both end, right? Now that extends also to other polarities or dualism. If we think of the whole, usually the whole is opposed to the parts or the individual. So we could say that the late modern Western, but particularly American in this case, has leaned toward a really abstract notion of freedom as individual freedom. So the individual is held up, and it's the human individual, and it's actually the male individual, and it's the white male individual. So we could go in that direction. There's a really abstract emphasis on a kind of abstract individualism. The other pole would be an abstract collectivism, which we see at work whenever there's a totalitarian regime, for instance. So I think what we can learn from Shirabindo and from Hegel and others like them is the requirement, the ethical requirement to think in a way that avoids reducing wholeness to one of its elements. And that's an ongoing task. You know, it's a very hard thing to do. But the first thing we need to do is to try to train ourselves through thinking, and this is where Hegel is so important, I think. Thinking in a way that doesn't split living or complex wholes into their constituent elements, because that's how we kill it, right? But ethically and politically, that the quandary then becomes how do we preserve the whole without sacrificing the individual, and simultaneously how do we honor the individual without sacrificing the whole? Okay? So there's no simple answer to that, but that's the problem that we're faced with, and we could also extend that looking at the human relative to the community of life on the planet or the whole Earth community. At this point, as we know, the human has dominated the whole of the rest of the Earth community. As you began by saying, there's no aspect of the living body of Earth that doesn't have the scarring of human presence. I mean, even just yesterday, I read a new study that in something like 200 countries, I can't remember, every male testicle tested has microplastics in it, just for instance. And of course, we know that mother's milk everywhere has forever chemicals in it, everywhere. I mean, so there's no body, the atmosphere itself, the ocean. There's no aspect of the living body of Earth and the whole Earth community that doesn't have sort of scarification, the negative imprint of human industrial growth society on it. Okay, so that's just an example of how the human has completely ignored its own integral relationship to the Earth community and the planet. That's the human and the rest of the planet. But we can extend that, to other areas as well, and that's the great intellectual and ethical challenge of our times, is to try to avoid reductionism, simplification in our thinking. And I'll just mention one last thing here in terms of big influence on me, a mentor, dear being, French thinker Edgar Morin, who's 100, he'll be 103 this summer, but he is he is a master of complexity and of the paradigm of complexity, complex thinking. So particularly for those of our viewers who can read French or Spanish or so many other languages, his many works are translated into pretty much every language, but not enough yet into English. Edgar Morin.
Nice. Yeah, I'll definitely check that out. I just wanted to ask you, you bring in, and it's in the title of your book as well, Gaia, and you bring in, so this is James Lovelock, the inventor of the Gaia hypothesis, now Gaia theory. And I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit of background about that.
Sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so Lovelock, he was a brilliant sort of scientist, engineer, visionary. He was hired by NASA to in the search for extraterrestrial life. And he came up with a proposal that we didn't actually need to send any spacecraft out to try to find life. We can just analyze the light spectra coming from planets, and we can look at Mars, and by analyzing the light through spec spectroscopy
Mhm.
analysis, we can pretty confidently determine that there's no life on the planet just by doing that. And that's because if there were life on the planet, there would be a chemical signature of the atmosphere being very far from equilibrium, maintaining itself in a dynamic equilibrium, which is what we have here on Earth, where, for instance, there is like 5-6% oxygen in the atmosphere, and only somewhere around 500 parts per million CO2, and very small amounts of methane and so on. So there's a mixture of gases in the atmosphere which are the way they are at very precise calibrated levels only because of the presence of life. So the Earth's atmosphere, which we depend on to live, because if the oxygen level falls much more, we won't be able to breathe. If it goes too higher, then the atmosphere would catch fire, right? The atmosphere is the way it is because of life, and it is maintained at just those levels because of life. And it turns out
Mhm.
it's not only the atmosphere, but the salinity of the oceans, even the movement of plate tectonics. So the structure of the Earth as we know it, and its dynamic equilibrium, was created by and for life. So this leads to the idea of Earth as a living, by which we mean self-organizing system. So a dynamic self-organizing system.
Mhm.
And he gave the name to that system. He chose the Greek word for the goddess of Earth, Gaia, Gaia, to describe that in a way to suggest the feeling that one can have in contemplating this living Earth, that it's not just a collection of objects, as Thomas Berry would say, but as a communion of subjects that are together in as a single living subject. Um, so this was Lovelock's initial theory, and it was initially resisted, criticized, but eventually recognized and went from just a hypothesis to a theory and became actually a main influence in what is now called Earth system science.
Mhm.
And Earth system science is actually an interdiscipline. It's many disciplines that come together, studying the relation between the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, all of the spheres of Earth. um, and it's Earth system science, of course, that gives us everything we know now about the climate catastrophe that's unfolding before our eyes. So that's Lovelock, and most Earth system scientists, however, don't use the term Gaia. Gaia is usually used by those who are um, more activist, either on the one hand, or more spiritually oriented on the other, who recognize and want to affirm the intrinsic value, ethical and spiritual value of this living earth. Because there's a big difference in the feeling tone between calling it the earth system and calling it Gaia. Right?
Yes,
Uh,
yes, yes.
right? And it's
Absolutely,
similarly,
yeah.
if you think of the divine, there's a big difference even between uh, Brahman and Ishvara, right? I mean, you can't really pray
Yeah.
to Brahman. Brahman is a word that captures the unfathomable mystery of the
Hmm.
absolute,
Hmm.
and it can open the third eye into the intuitive realm. But if you want to move from the heart, you need to something more personal. So either
Hmm.
the mother, or the Lord,
Or yeah.
is how anyway. So I think there's something similar going on with the word Gaia, using the word Gaia in contrast to Earth system. I think we need both terms. And
Hmm.
I'm so grateful for and I follow closely the continuing development of Earth system science. It's a major achievement in the evolution of Gaia herself. Gaia has evolved to the point where through Earth system science, she is now able to reflect on herself, on her physical nature, and get a kind of complex scan of all of her organ systems. If we look at what Earth system science is giving us, it's something like what happened to us if we went and had like MRIs of all of our Earth of all of our systems. So that's what Earth
Hmm.
system science gives us. But thinking of Earth in terms of Gaia gives us something more. It helps us intuit and feel into the living and even sacred character of this greater body in and through whom our bodies have their being.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. A question that comes up, I guess, in approaching an integral knowledge in a way, or even that term, the ecology of knowledge, is how each perspective is important. It seems as though Gaia would also allude to a different type of a metaphysics, which grants, a certain kind of autonomy or beingness to something like the Earth, whereas maybe in the more scientific view, there's questions about that, or it's just left out. But it seems to me like, bringing the spiritual aspect, it it can help, is necessary to me in terms of realizing that I'm not the center of this. There's something that we can open to that can actually, that you can become with, that has its own way of knowing, it has its own types of knowledge, it has its own, you could, with quotation marks, it thinks in its own way, it becomes in along, according to dynamics that we are a part of, but are not always obvious to us as our kind of atomized individuals. That we are kind
Yes.
of, we inherit that kind of a, in modernity, we inherit that kind of a worldview, and I did anyway. That makes me look out and feel like everything is needs to be made sense of from my own centeredness. But
Yeah, and as an artist, you will know this very well, as an artist and musician, that you know, when you're working on your dissertation, that's a very different mode than when you're doing your music. And
mhm,
this is one of the great gifts of being human, is that we have these two modes. Edgar Morin speaks of these two modes as the prosaic and the poetic.
mhm,
And we need the prosaic, obviously, to survive, to order our affairs, to do good science. But without the poetic, and the poetic doesn't just mean poetry, it means the participatory, the ecstatic, the devotional, the celebratory, the embodied, the
mhm,
imaginal, all of these things. So, and in a way, it's the latter that is, in some sense, more human, as we're seeing with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence can do a lot of the prosaic stuff as well as
mhm,
most of us, and even better than many of us can do. But without the truly poetic or the creative, we're not really fully human. And I imagine this is also why Sri Aurobindo, devoted so much time to Savitri, which
absolutely.
captures what could not be captured in Synthesis of Yoga and Life Divine and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely, yeah, my work has kind of taken me to trying to find those horizons where thinking and music can kind of co-inform or be a co-creative process rather than thinking about music.
Hmm.
Taking music as the subject of a thinking being, because I am a musical being as well as a thinking being, and they both, they work in different ways, I think, and
Hmm.
they there's different types of knowledges that come from both. And yeah, that's really well said. Again, in terms of the question of the integral, I think that this kind of the multiplicity is really, is we're being called to, I think part of the problem of history is that we have kind of systematically reduced multiplicity to little pieces, bytes of information that can be easily ordered at our own, in an anthropocentric sense, ordered at our own will. We can order nature or other humans at our own will. And
Mm, mm,
it's part of the problem of what we inherit, I think. And I just wanted to ask a question about how your work engages in and in consciousness studies, because thinking like in terms of the school, I mean, being founded you know by Haridas Chaudhuri and the questions of integral yoga, I mean, there's definitely a call for the emergence or the creation, the building, the opening to, the descent of, there's so many different ways we can think about it, but a new consciousness. Yeah. And we mentioned
mm,
earlier the supramental is what the name that Sri Aurobindo gives it. But in terms of how you approach that in your work, how is it that, and what does that look, how can we talk about that in a way that kind of opens us to changing the future, changing our habits, opening to new ways? You mentioned creativity, importance of creativity in this process as well. But in terms of what Sri Aurobindo, is talking about in terms of an integral consciousness, it's like the ability to simultaneously know the one in the many in
mm.
the one as many. So
Yeah.
it's definitely something that I'm not normally in my normative and habitual mode of becoming is it's not my normal state, but it's an invitation to say, well, what happens if we, through practice and yogic practice or other types of practices that can open you to other kinds of consciousnesses. But it seems to me that that's really a part of how he is asking us to address the problems of the past, while also how is it that we can create a different future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh, well, each of us will come to this obviously with our own karma, our own gifts, our own positionality.
Mhm.
Uh, I imagine very few of us will have the ability to open to directly to the supramental in the way that Sri Aurobindo and the mother did.
Yeah.
Um, so in one way of that's been very helpful for me to think of our moment, our collective planetary moment here, uh, is in terms of what this German philosopher, psychiatrist Karl Jaspers called an axial age. And
Mhm.
you know the axial age is that period between the 6th and 3rd century BC or BCE, when the Upanishads and the Buddha, Plato, Socrates, the Jewish prophets, Zoroaster, um, all appeared at the same time, basically, and gave birth to so much of the world's spiritual and philosophical traditions. So that was the first axial age. Some people believe that we're now in a second axial age. And one of the aspects of the second axial age is, of course, the encounter among these various world traditions, East and West. And Chowdhury, of course, and Sri Aurobindo himself were major figures in bridging East and West. So second axial age in our own times, there's East and West. Obviously, there's also the indigenous is coming in now, the earth-based
Mhm.
traditions. Um, so the multiplicity of spiritual paths and the recognition of a multiplicity of spiritual paths, of spiritual potentials. It's also related to the recognition of the multiplicity of ways of knowing that you were bringing up and that we were just talking about in terms of not only the two main modes of the prosaic and the poetic, but the other modes of knowing, the somatic, the aesthetic, um,
Mhm. Mhm.
So part of this second axial age is an opening our awareness to to multiplicity in unity, and the unity of multiplicity, as you were saying, this challenge of,
Mhm.
again, of being able to think and respond creatively to complexity. That's one of the great challenges of the second axial age. But in terms of the religious, specifically religious or spiritual challenge of the second axial age, the first axial age, what all of these traditions shared was an opening to the transcendent, whether
Mhm.
that was called Brahman, or Tao, or Torah, or Ma'at for, or the Logos for the Greeks.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
different epiphanies of the sacred, different names for the great mystery, and a realization that it was possible, particularly for the prophets and the sages and the saints, to have a direct relationship to the transcendent. This is the great gift of the first axial age. And they all gave birth to their own traditions. Um, and now we find ourselves in a world where all of these traditions can encounter each other, can be into dialogue with each other, but it also raises the question, well, is there one that is more true than the other? Is there some truth beyond all of the traditions? How do we deal with this multiplicity?
Mhm. Mhm.
So I hope you don't hear that noise. There's trucks outside. Okay, great. Uh, so the second axial age, the way I conceive of it, is an invitation and a calling for us to, in a sense, bracket the question of the ultimate beyond the here and now, not denying it, but just saying that, okay, look,
Mhm.
you're going to have Muslims who say this, Christians who say this, Jews, uh, uh, Sikhs, Hindus. You're going to have all of these traditions who each claim to have their own path to the absolute. Why don't we think of all of us meeting in a great cathedral? And the great cathedral is this living earth. And like all great cathedrals, we can imagine that there are side chapels, many side chapels. And each one of these side chapels we can think of as devoted to a particular tradition, a particular way. Whether it's Pure Land Buddhism, whether it's Kashmir Shaivism, whether it's, there's all of these, there are side chapels. One of
Mhm.
them may actually lead more directly to the absolute than the other. Perhaps they all lead in their own way to the same goal. We can't say for sure. We might have our own conviction individually, which, what is the case. But one thing we can agree on is to meet in the common temple of Gaia and consider this world as, in some sense, at least our privileged manifestation of whatever the great mystery is, where we are called to live in uh, uh, peace and harmony
Mhm.
and justice together, celebrating the great mystery, right? So this to me is the image that I hold of what the second axial age is calling us to do. And I speak of this in my book, Becoming Gaia, drawing from Hegel, with the idea of thinking of Gaia as a concrete universal. So in contrast to the first axial age, where the universal is more or less a transcendent universal,
Yeah.
that has a relationship to the here and now, but is also beyond it. The second axial age is inviting us to think of the universal in concrete terms, in non-dual terms, as embracing and manifesting here and now in this, in and as this Earth community, right? So,
Mhm.
so that's how I'm thinking of it. Which doesn't mean that there's not a beyond, that there isn't,
Right.
but and we're free to pursue that on our own and in our own little Gnostic communities if we have them. But we're also called to live together and to worship together in the common temple of Gaia.
Mhm. Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. So well put. I was wondering how, like, how we think about that in relation to different, I guess, getting into metaphysics, but like a lot of the a lot of the metaphysics that help support this kind of a goal and the necessity of embodiment and of our metaphysics that don't negate or cast matter aside and say that it's a secondary or it's not as real. Or so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how imminence, like thinking imminently, is part of this.
Mm,
And again, it doesn't mean to just negate transcendence, and which would just be kind of just be a turning of the system in one way. But there, I think there's an integral question would not just to say, well, now we need to think imminently and let's get rid of transcendence is bad, but more like how is it that we can change our relation to these types of different approaches to holism. Um,
mm. Yeah,
and I guess and also like the ethics of politics that come with that, because again, like there is a politics to transcendence, meaning like you can privilege and tell people, well, here's our practice and our goal is to get out. So it
yes,
doesn't leave much social response. There's no reason for social responsibility necessarily. And I'm just wondering again to bring in the how is it that this addresses the ethical and the political side
yeah,
of it's problematic.
yeah. Well, there's different routes, I think that I have enjoyed pursuing. One of the first ones that I wasn't even aware of, but it clearly shaped my thinking and my psyche at a deep level. I was raised Catholic, and
Hmm.
the central rite in Catholicism is the Mass, of course, where people are invited to participate in a ritual where you become the body of Christ, right?
Hmm.
And so there's the idea that in some sense you are not other than the Christ principle. And similarly, there's the idea that the divine logos or cosmic logos became flesh, or that the transcendent or the divine not only entered into but became matter, and
Hmm.
involved itself or
Hmm.
himself
Hmm.
in space-time. So theologically, this is the whole doctrine of incarnation. And of course, the great Christian mystics and leading up to the great philosopher Hegel, and Teilhard de Chardin and
Hmm.
Jung, they're all philosophers of incarnation in a sense that they see the reality of the divine, the reality of the divine is that it, now to speak in Sri Aurobindo's terms, is that it involves itself in creation, in matter, in time, right? Um, so that's the Christian sort of foundation, as it were, of my soul. But then with Hegel, I learned how to think that in a coherent way, and he does it through the concept of the infinite. So if we think of the transcendent as infinite,
Hmm.
or the absolute as infinite, Hegel helps us see that it's actually a mistake in thinking if we imagine the infinite as somehow outside of the finite. Because if we do that, what we've done is we've put a boundary between the infinite and the finite.
Hmm.
But if we put a boundary between the infinite and the finite, we've thereby made the infinite finite, which is a contradiction, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
The so the infinite is only infinite if it is in the finite, right? The infinite cannot be infinite unless it is in the finite. See what I mean? There can
Yeah,
there,
yeah, yeah.
so
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah.
that's the Hegel, that's what I get from Hegel. And Sri Aurobindo does it, quite in his own way with the whole could not evolve toward uh, the fully awakened awareness of infinite consciousness, being, consciousness, and bliss, unless it were always already involved in
Involved.
in it, you know. So this is what I love about Sri Aurobindo, the idea of Purnadvaita, or integral non-dualism. It's so consistent with the Hegelian uh, uh, grasp of the true nature of the absolute on the one hand.
Hmm.
It's fully
Hmm.
consistent with Christian incarnational uh, philosophy or theology of history, or the idea of what Teilhard de Chardin calls Christogenesis, cosmogenesis, or the evolution of the cosmos as Christogenesis. They're one and the same thing. The coming into being and continual manifestation of the divine in and as a living cosmos, right? And
Mhm.
of course, we're learning so much about the cosmos in our own times, but practically speaking, our experience of the cosmos is this Earth. Yes, we can go to the moon, and we can send a probe to Mars, and a probe even outside of the envelope of the solar system. But um, for all practical purposes, this Earth and its atmosphere is our living boundary of the universal, right? So, so this is the proximate body of it's the closest we can get to the body of God. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah.
So that's how I approach it. And that body, of course, is itself a community, as Thomas Berry says, is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. That includes every living being, all of the plants and animals and insects, and but not only that, but as our indigenous brothers and sisters um, have always known and know now, uh, the land itself, the rivers, the
Hmm.
lakes, the forests,
Hmm.
these too are alive, you know. Um, so I guess that's how I try to approach it. Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I guess just the last question I have, because we're running out of time, but in terms of approaching activism, approaching the global crisis, which, as you say, the data is mounting, and it's it's sometimes hard to kind of find those points of affirmation, those points of hope, yet we need
Mhm.
to. And
Mhm.
so I know even when I was a younger person maturing into the world, I became an activist, but I burnt out very quickly because I didn't feel like I could equal the problem at all, and it just seemed to take from me
Mhm.
my will and power. And that's where I in my life, when I did go to India, spirituality and an imminent spirituality really um helped to help me remake myself in a way that gave I guess opened me to potentials that weren't just on the social or the political level, but on a cosmic, like a psycho-cosmological. And one way that I like to think about that is like the interface between the finite, or how we confront our own finitude, and the infinite. And there are certain metaphysics that will just keep those as separate. We are finite, and that's just how well we are. But the milieu of thinking that I've been studying, and what the people that we're speaking about are they don't accept that conclusion. And it's I think it's so fundamentally important, not only in how we can direct our will and where we can get potentials to be equal to this problematic, to be equal to the song of the earth. You use that phrase um in your paper here, but also like how we can approach thinking ecologically on a social level. So through the political systems that we have right now. And
Mhm.
that was one thing that, as I was speaking to people, it seemed that our relationship to that infinite, or you could say in terms of the language of time, to ourselves as eternal, the soul aspect, the soul essence. Sri Aurobindo also brings in the evolving soul, which again, it's a different conversation of how that's important to me. But just in terms of how we think, and you use these terms like short circuit and long circuit.
Huh.
And I that's where this question is coming from. It seems as though our political systems are very short circuit. People are fighting for 4 years to convince everybody why I would be a good candidate for, and it's a 4-year vision. Um, Now that's very short when we think about geological eras. It's a blink of the eye.
Yeah.
So we're calling for longer circuit. So now we start thinking, well, in my lifetime, we need to start having goals. And then even more, it's the next natural step. Well, we need to do this for our children, you know.
Yeah.
And and in terms of, my engagement with other people on this topic, I always wonder, okay, well, what even after our children, our children's children, where is it that we stop caring, and where is it
Yeah.
that we stop having the capacity to not only empathize and feel into that, but really know that we are that, which is where
Yeah.
the non-dual aspect comes in. I don't think it's enough just to rationally think I'm doing this for my children. We need to know that we are that, which
Mm,
brings in the problem of, this is where the idea of like we are eternal. So we are that in some way.
hmm.
And I guess that's where I see, in terms of the idea of the evolution of consciousness, or the idea of consciousness, and how we cultivate ourselves, and what types of, kind of, you could say, technologies of becoming that we're engaged in. I think how that really is going to also determine how we can reconceive of the future based on a whole different, not only knowledge, like data that we can derive, but actually like an affective, or like an embodied sense of I am that.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Yeah, this is definitely we need another hour for this. Um, I give my best shot in the last chapter of Becoming Gaia, which is the longest chapter, and it's also the most personal, and it's called Living in End Times, uh, Beyond Hope and Despair, right? So
Hmm.
I give my own sort of non-dual meditation on some of these issues because more and more people are finding it hard to find any kind of hope, you know, and are falling into despair. And at the same time, there are many who are saying, no, we've got to have hope, and there's radical hope, there's active hope, and the others are just doomers, and so this conflict between hope and despair is only going to intensify over the next few years. So
Hmm.
um, if, as seems likely, it will become harder and harder to imagine a positive or better future for our children, or for our children's children, or even for the seventh generation, then yeah, the questions become, well, what is the ground of what can ground our action? What can ground our faith in the affirmation that it's better to be alive than not, that it's good to do certain things versus other things if it seems hopeless. So what I try to do in this last chapter is to walk around the intuition of uh, the not only the intrinsic but the infinite value of the good, and the good as things that we recognize as intrinsically good. That
Hmm.
it's we know that when we are loved by somebody, when we feel love from somebody, unconditional love, we know that that is intrinsically good, and in a sense of infinite value. We, a parent will do something, at least a good parent will do something for their child, not because they are expecting some sort of reward or outcome. Without even thinking, they will often, risk their own lives, and actually, people do that for strangers too. There are people with amazing acts of courage and compassion for total strangers, acting in the moment because at the deepest level they feel and they affirm through their action that certain things are intrinsically good. So the question is, why is that? How can that possibly be? And the proposal that I make in this chapter, and it's based on my own experience and intuition, even though there are moments where I need to struggle to find my way back to those intuitions because of the challenges of the moment. But when these intuitions come to me, there's a sense that uh, that the things that we value, the things that we do, because we feel in our bones, in our deepest soul, that they are intrinsically good, are never lost, and that there is an eternal quality to being itself. I mean, if being truly is infinite, sat, if being truly is infinite, then
Mhm.
it's never lost, and that's true of our actions in this world. Um, and that's a kind of consolation, when as I'm continue to age, and as I see the, increasing inevitability of less and less time left in this incarnation. I can get gripped with fear and sometimes regret, and at the prospect of losing the people I love, losing the things I love, and so on. And alone at night in bed, I'm sure we all have this sense of, wow, you know, what does it mean that all of this might be lost? But what if, even as it inevitably passes, there's a sense in which it's not lost, that it is held and loved, not only contemplated, but loved and affirmed by the greater being in and through whom we have our being, and possibly even greater beings. There is the absolute, there's the Lord, but perhaps there are other beings in between our own individual souls and this absolute. There are communities of beings, higher dimensional beings. There's a higher dimensional reality within which this three-dimensional temporal unfolding is always already being held. I mean, this
Mm.
is a kind of like mystical insight that has come to me repeatedly, which I struggle to remember sometimes in those moments where I'm gripped with fear and potential despair. So, and I think this is the why people like Sri Aurobindo and the mother and others can be such a great um, companion to us along the way, because they help us contact and cultivate these intuitions. But we'd need another hour or more to pursue this one, I think.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, infinite conversation.
Yeah.
But yes, I just want to thank you for those words. I definitely myself will read your book. I haven't as of yet, but definitely will. I think that this article is just a wonderful invitation into to do that, but also just to contemplate these ideas, and not only contemplate, but really question, who we are and how we're becoming, and question our relationship to the earth and community. And I just want to thank you for offering that into this community and this journal. And I want to thank you for your time today. It's always so inspiring to talk with you, and just really appreciate you.
My pleasure, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Till next time.
Until next time.